The wind came sideways, and it came with teeth. Elias Bruin crouched at the base of the north line, one gloved hand wrapped around a fence post, the other jammed into the gap between two lath slats where snow had begun to pack. He counted under his breath, the way Thorvald's notebook had taught him. 3 seconds of pressure, then release. The slat gave, sighed, held. 40 yards down the line, a drift was already climbing the fence's face. Low, long, patient, exactly the shape it was supposed to take. Rook barked once, sharp, from somewhere near the gate. Elias didn't look up. He didn't have time to look up. The wind was gusting past 50 now, he guessed, maybe faster, and the lane behind him, the lane that fed the whole herd down to the low corrals, was still black dirt, still open, still clear. 6 inches of snow lay across the pasture on either side of the fence. Nothing on the lane. Nothing at all. "Hold," he said to no one. "Hold." A slat cracked somewhere to his left. He didn't turn toward the sound. There would be time to mend it, or there wouldn't, and either way the counting continued, because the counting was the only thing he could control. Behind him, through the white, he heard Domino scream. A sound no man forgets once he's heard a horse make it. And he still didn't turn, because 40 yards of new-built fence stood between the herd and a 15-foot bank of snow that was trying, right now, in this hour, to bury the only road out of the valley. He had 11 days of feed left. He had one working lane. He had a dead man's numbers in his coat pocket and no one alive who believed in them. Somewhere out past the white, a voice was calling. He couldn't make out the words yet. He wasn't certain it was even a word, and not just the wind finding a new shape to wear. He kept counting. 3 months earlier, none of this existed. Elias Bruin had married into the Aldous land the way a man marries into trouble, quietly, and without asking enough questions first. When old Thorvald Aldous died in the spring, his will divided the ranch 3 ways: the south pasture and the good barn to his son Halvard, the home quarter and the cattle to his daughter Marta, and to Marta's husband, the outsider, the carpenter's son from Bismarck who'd never run cattle a day in his life, the low north section. Everyone in the valley knew the north section. It sat in a bowl below the ridge, and every winter for as long as anyone could remember, the first real storm sealed its lane shut with a drift that didn't clear until March. "You'll want a shovel and a strong back," Halvard told him at the reading of the will, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "That ground swallows fences whole. Pa lost 3 of them trying." He clapped Elias once on the shoulder, the gesture of a man closing a subject. Some land's just made for losing. Marta said nothing that day. She only watched her husband's face, the way she always did when she was deciding whether to worry. It was Marta who found the notebook, 2 weeks later, wedged behind a loose board in the tack room. Her father's handwriting, cramped and slanting, dated across 11 winters. Elias read it by lamplight at the kitchen table while she mended a shirt beside him, and he read it again the next night and the night after that. Thorvald had not lost 3 fences to bad luck. He had lost them to a wrong idea, chased for 11 years and never once questioned that a solid wall stopped snow. The old man's last entry said otherwise. Half open, the notebook read, in a hand gone shaky near the end. Not closed. "Let it breathe, or it will drown you." Beside the words, a rough sketch. A fence built of lath slats spaced with gaps between them. Each slat a specific width, each gap a specific width, the ratio underlined twice. 1-to-1, near enough. For feet high, set 35 feet back from what needed protecting, not closer, because the drift needed room to lie down before it reached the lane. "He never built it," Marta said, reading over his shoulder. "He only wrote it. Then I will." She studied him a long moment in the lamplight, the way she had studied him at the reading of the will, deciding whether to worry. This time she didn't. She only turned the page back to the sketch and traced the ratio with one finger, as if to fix it in her own memory alongside his. She didn't answer with words. She only refilled his coffee and set the cup down harder than she needed to, which was, for Marta, its own kind of blessing. The first attempt went up in September, 400 feet of green-cut willow lath nailed edge to edge with barely a finger's width between each board, because it looked stronger that way, and because some part of Elias, the part that still wanted, badly, to be taken seriously, could not make himself believe that a fence with holes in it would stop anything. He worked 11 days on it. He drove 206 posts by hand. Cornelius Strand rode up on the last day, the valley's most respected stockman, a man who had run cattle through 6 major blizzards without losing a head, and he sat his horse at the fence line for a long moment before he spoke. "You've built a wall, Brune," he said. "Snow doesn't knock. It comes over a wall, and it comes down heavy, right where you don't want it. Your father-in-law learned that the hard way 3 times. Man doesn't usually need a 4th demonstration, but I expect you'll want one." Word of the fence had already traveled the valley by then, the way word travels in a place with more weather than neighbors. At the Mercantile, Ruth Kessling told anyone who'd listened that a Bismarck carpenter's son building a fence out of scrap with boards was hardly cause for alarm one way or the other, though she allowed she'd never seen the North Lane hold a fence past October in her 30 years of trading there. Bernd Lindqvist, shoeing horses at the smithy, put it more plainly. A man who couldn't run a straight line of solid lumber had no business calling himself a builder, gaps or no gaps. And old Sven Hallstad, who farmed the quarter section closest to the county road and had buried 2 fences of his own over the years, said only that he'd wait and see, the way he waited and saw most things, with his arms crossed and his opinion held in reserve until the weather cast the deciding vote. The first real storm of the season, nothing serious, 9 inches over a night, wind under 20, proved Cornelius right within a week. Elias walked the line the next morning and found the drift exactly where the old stockman had said it would be, piled high and steep directly against the solid boards, spilling over the top, already reaching for the lane behind it. 2 sections had buckled outright under the weight, lath snapped clean at the base. He stood there a long time with his hands in his pockets before he pulled out the notebook again. Half open. Let it breathe. He'd read the words a dozen times, and still built the fence his own fear told him to build. Solid, because solid felt safe. Now he walked the broken sections and understood, finally, in his hands and not just his head, what his father-in-law meant. A solid fence didn't stop snow. It caught wind on its face, and the wind, forced upward and over, dropped its load the instant it cleared the top, right at the base, right where it did the most damage. A fence with gaps let the wind bleed through, slowed but not stopped, and the snow it carried fell out gradually, gently, along a long low ridge instead of one violent drift. He tore out 60 feet of the worst section and rebuilt it that week to Thorvald's ratio, lath and gap, near enough 1-to-1. The whole run set back the full 35 feet the notebook specified instead of the 20 he'd used to save on lumber. To test it, he tied a length of red yarn to the top rail every 10 feet, so he could watch from the house with the field glasses and see which way the air moved across the face. The wind rose 2 nights later, nothing severe, but enough. In the morning the yarn on the old solid section hung dead still, buried under 3 feet of new drift. The yarn on the rebuilt 60 feet stood out sideways, fluttering, alive. Behind it, the snow lay low and long, a gentle white ridge instead of a wall, and it stopped 18 feet short of the lane. Marta walked the line with him that morning and said only, "It breathed." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He started tearing out the rest of the fence that same afternoon. Rebuilding 400 feet took the better part of 6 weeks, working most days from before light until after dark. Marta's younger brother Peter helping on weekends for a share of next year's calves, the 2 of them driving posts, and splitting lath in weather that turned colder by the week. The ledger Elias kept nailed to the barn wall told the story in numbers, chalked and re-chalked, for 110 posts driven, 1,100 lath slats cut, $62 spent on nails against a season's wages of perhaps 200, if the herd came through whole. By late October the chalk read 340 feet complete, and the number sat there, unmoving, for 4 days when an early ice storm stopped the work cold and cracked 18 of the newest posts clean through. The work itself was slower than either man had reckoned. Splitting willow lath to a true width took a practiced eye, and more than one board went to kindling before it went to the fence. Each ruined length another line on the chalkboard nobody but Elias seemed to want to read. Peter, 16 and still more boy than rancher, asked once why they didn't simply space the boards by feel instead of measuring every gap against the notebook's ratio, and Elias had no answer that satisfied either of them beyond the old man's own words, underlined twice. Near enough 1-to-1. Not by feel, by the numbers, because feel was exactly what had built the first fence and feel was exactly what had failed. That was the low point. Elias stood at the barn that night totaling the loss. $9 in split lumber, for days of lost time, winter closing faster than the fence line was growing. And for the first time, he let himself say the thing out loud to Marta. Your father tried this 11 years and never finished it once. Maybe the land really is made for losing. He never had the last page, Marta said. She'd have known. She'd read the notebook cover to cover twice over. He wrote the ratio the winter before he died. He never lived to test it. You're not failing at his idea, Elias. You're the first one far enough along to fail at your own mistakes instead of his. He went back out the next morning before the frost had lifted and reset the cracked posts one at a time. By the second week of November, the fence stood complete. 400 feet of gapped lath, 35 feet back from the lane. The chalkboard reading 400 of 400 for the first time all season. In town that week, the community's verdict split along familiar lines. Old Ruth Kessling, who ran the mercantile, said she'd seen the drift pattern with her own eyes from the Aldous Road and thought there might be something to it. Bernd Lindqvist, the blacksmith, said a fence with holes in it looked like poor carpentry no matter how it performed, and he wasn't alone in that opinion. Cornelius Strand said nothing at all when the subject came up, which from Cornelius was its own kind of statement. Then came the 18th of November and the signs. The barometer in the kitchen dropped 9 points between breakfast and supper, faster than Elias had ever watched it fall. Domino paced his stall most of the afternoon and wouldn't settle to feed. Rook wouldn't leave the porch and growled low at nothing, at the empty yard, at the darkening line of clouds stacking up along the ridge. That evening a pale ring stood around a rising moon, wide and unmistakable. Cornelius rode past at dusk on his way home and reined up at the gate when Elias mentioned the ring. Rings come and go all winter, he said. I've seen 40 of them and one storm worth remembering. You'll wear yourself thin chasing every bad sign the sky throws at you. He nodded toward the fence, faint in the last light. Your gapped walls held for small weather. Big weather's an entirely different animal, Brune, and it's coming whether you've got a ring in the sky or not. He rode on. He did not slow down to say it kindly, and he did not mean it unkindly either. It was simply what he believed. The blizzard broke before midnight. It came in fast, the wind climbing from a whisper to a roar inside 2 hours, and by the time Elias had Domino settled and the last of the loose stock pushed toward the home corral, visibility had dropped to nothing beyond the length of an outstretched arm. This was the storm the valley would talk about for years afterward. The storm that dropped 31 inches in 18 hours and drove wind past 55 miles an hour across open ground. The storm that closed every road in the county and left 4 ranches without power for the better part of a week. Across the valley, conventional fences did exactly what Thorvald's notebook had predicted for 11 pages running. Halvard's solid board line along the south pasture caught the wind broadside and built a drift 11 feet high directly against its face by morning, burying 200 yards of good grazing ground and nearly trapping 6 head of his own cattle against it. Sven Hallstad's post and rail fencing near the county road fared no better, buried under a wall of white that climbed higher with every hour the wind held steady from the northwest. The county road itself, unprotected by any fence at all, filled corner to corner within the first 4 hours, closing the only route to town. The Aldous North Lane stayed open. Not clear. Nothing stayed perfectly clear in wind like that, but open, the snow lying low and long on either side exactly as the yarn test had promised, the drift never climbing past 2 feet where the fence held true. Elias worked the line through the worst of it anyway, because 40 feet near the eastern corner had been driven into softer ground than the rest, and somewhere past midnight he felt it give. He found the trouble by feel more than sight. 2 posts leaning hard under a drift that had, against the ratio, begun climbing rather than spreading, the ground beneath them too soft to hold against the sideways pressure of the wind. For a moment, crouched there with his hands going numb in the wind, trying to take the lantern out of his grip, he felt the same cold doubt he'd felt in September, staring at broken lath in the snow. If the ratio could fail here, on ground he'd tested himself, it could fail anywhere along the line, and there would be no fixing 400 feet of fence in the dark. He drove a 3rd post at an angle to brace the pair, working fast, packing loose snow hard against the base the way Thorvald's notebook described for exactly this failure. Soft ground, not bad ratio. The posts held. The drift resumed its long, low shape. The lane stayed open behind it. Near 2 in the morning, through a break in the wind, he heard Cornelius Strand's voice, hoarse, half swallowed by the storm, calling from somewhere past the buried county road. Cornelius had ridden out at the first sign of trouble to check on an elderly widow's stock 3 miles off and been caught when the road closed behind him, his horse foundering belly deep in a drift with no fence anywhere near to slow the snow's fall. Elias followed the sound with a length of rope and domino, walking the fence line itself as a guide rail through country he could no longer see, because the fence line was the one place in 30 miles where the snow hadn't buried the ground past a man's knees. He found Cornelius 40 yards off the buried road, exhausted, his horse unable to rise. It took the better part of an hour to work the animal free and lead both men and horses back along the fence's open corridor to the barn. Cornelius said almost nothing on the walk back. At the barn door, stripping off his frozen gloves, he looked once at the gapped fence line disappearing into the dark and reached out to lay his bare palm flat against the nearest slat. Not a word, just the touch, the kind of gesture a man makes when he's testing whether a thing is as solid as it's just proven itself to be. By morning the wind had dropped, and the valley lay buried and silent under new snow, the sky a hard, scoured blue. Halvard's south pasture would take 3 days to dig clear. The county road stayed closed for 5. The Aldous North Lane needed only 2 hours with a shovel before the herd could be walked down to water. The chalkboard in the barn still read 400 of 400. Elias added one more line beneath it that morning, in smaller numbers. 2 posts reset, 1 corner held, 11 days of feed remaining. Small arithmetic, but it was the only kind that mattered now. Cornelius rode out again that week, alone, and spent the better part of an afternoon walking the fence line slat by slat with his own tape measure, checking the gaps against Thorvald's ratio without asking permission or offering commentary. When he finished, he didn't seek Elias out to say anything about it. He simply rode home. 3 days later, a wagon arrived at the Aldous gate loaded with cut lath and cedar posts. Cornelius's own timber, delivered without a note, without a word, left stacked by the barn where anyone could see it plainly for what it was. Ruth Kessling began telling customers at the Mercantile that the Aldous North Line hadn't lost an inch of lane all winter. Bernd Lindqvist stopped mentioning the carpentry. Sven Hallstad, who had waited and seen the way he waited and saw most things, rebuilt his own fence along the county road that spring with gaps cut to the same ratio, though he told anyone who asked that he'd worked it out himself from watching the weather, which was, in its own way, close enough to the truth. By the following autumn, 3 more fences along the valley wore the same gapped pattern, 35 feet back, near enough 1 to 1, though none of the men who built them ever quite said where the idea had come from. Marta kept the notebook on the kitchen shelf after that, not hidden anymore, its cover soft and split from handling. She added nothing to it. There was nothing left that needed adding. On a quiet evening in late December, with the herd fed and the lane clear and Rook asleep by the stove, Elias walked out alone to the fence line with a coil of wire and a handful of nails, tightening a slat that had worked loose in the last wind. The moon stood high and bare, no ring around it now, and his breath went up pale and steady into the cold. He worked the wire slow, testing each turn with his thumb the way the old man's notebook had taught him to test everything, and thought, without needing to say it to anyone, a wall only looks strong until the weather asks its real question.